The last sound of the workday at Turkey Springs was the sound of a truck door closing. It was a specific sound, the particular dull clunk of a heavy cab door in cold air, metal on metal, the brief hollow resonance of it, moving out through the trees and then gone. The ponderosa pines on all sides absorbed it without comment. The forest at dusk in the White Mountains of Arizona in November is that kind of place, a place that takes the sounds people make and returns nothing and does not seem to notice the difference. The Turkey Springs logging site occupied a section of cleared high country forest in the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest. The ponderosa pines thinned in one small area by several weeks of deliberate documented work. The cut timber stacked at the margins of the clearing in the way that work like this leaves things, evidence of human effort arranged at the edges of a space that was still, in almost every direction, a tree-covered mountain wilderness, stretching for miles without a paved road or an inhabited building anywhere along its length. The smell of the cut timber was still in the cold air when the men climbed into the truck. Fresh pine sap, sawdust, the particular sharpness of wood, open to the cold. These are the smells of physical work ending, and on the evening of November 5th, 1975, they were the most ordinary things in the world. Mike Rogers, who held the United States Forest Service contract on this section of forest, had been bringing a crew out here for weeks. The work was straightforward in its description, if not always in its execution. Selective clearing of smaller trees to improve forest health and reduce fire risk, the kind of land management contract the USFS awarded regularly to small operators in the Apache-Sitgreaves. Men who knew the forest and owned the equipment and could be relied upon to bring a crew and do the job within the terms of the agreement. Rogers was from Snowflake, Arizona, a small community on the Colorado Plateau, roughly 30 miles southwest of where the crew worked each day. The distance from Snowflake to Turkey Springs was not far, by straight-line measure, but the road between them, unpaved forest track through the White Mountains, accessible only to vehicles prepared for loose rock and packed dirt at high elevation, made it a commute of a particular kind, the kind that begins and ends in two very different versions of the world. Snowflake in 1975 was a quiet place, wide streets, low buildings, the flat quality of light that belongs to the high desert, a water tower visible from a distance against the sky, the kind of community where most people knew most other people, and where a 7-man logging crew represented a recognizable, unremarkable group of men doing recognizable, unremarkable work. The Forest Service contract Rogers held was a piece of paper sitting somewhere in a Snowflake office while the men drove, a document with his name on it, a plot number, a deadline, the specific section of forest marked in the careful bureaucratic language of a government land management agreement. It existed as such contracts exist, as a quiet administrative fact, noting what had been agreed and what was still owed, the gap between the two narrowing with each working day. The 7 men who worked the Rogers contract on November 5th, 1975, were Mike Rogers himself, Travis Walton, Dwayne Smith, John Goulet, Ken Peterson, Alan Dallas, and Steve Pierce. Most of them were from Snowflake or its surrounding area. They are named in Navajo County Sheriff's Department records. From that month, their names entered into the official documentation of that office. For reasons that had not yet come to pass, on the morning they drove to Turkey Springs for another day of work. On the evening of November 5th, they were simply 7 men from the same community who worked the same contract and shared the same truck for the drive home. The way men working remote contract jobs have always shared whatever vehicle was going in the right direction. The Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest is large enough that the Turkey Springs worksite was genuinely, documentably remote. The forest spans approximately 2 million acres across east central Arizona, with elevations reaching above 11,000 feet in places. The terrain broken by ridgelines and drainages, and dense pine stands that create areas of near total seclusion, places that the USFS land management records describe with the matter-of-fact precision of agencies that know their territory well. Turkey Springs sat in that kind of country, accessible only by unpaved forest roads, well beyond the reach of any passing traffic, far enough from any highway that the sound of a vehicle on the track through the trees was unusual enough to notice. On a weekday evening in November, the crew loading into Rogers's truck at the end of the workday were the only people for miles in most directions. This is simply a geographic fact, confirmable on any map of the region. It has no particular meaning in itself. Remote forests in Arizona were full of people doing contract work in 1975, and most of them drove home without incident at the end of the day, and most of those drives are not recorded anywhere. The Turkey Springs site in the last of the afternoon light on November 5th had the particular look of a place where recent work has been interrupted by the approach of evening rather than completed. The cleared area at the center of the site held the evidence of weeks of effort, stumps at ground level, the cut timber stacked at the margins, the ground between disturbed in the specific way that chainsaw work and manual labor disturb it, with wood chips and sawdust worked into the surface, and the occasional boot print pressed into the softer soil near where the trees had been brought down. At the edges of the clearing, where the thinning work had not yet reached, the ponderosa pines stood in their usual density, their lower trunks bare and straight, their canopy high enough above the clearing to frame a large rectangle of sky that was deepening from pale blue to a washed orange along the tree line to the southwest where the sun had recently gone. The ponderosa pine is a particular tree. It grows tall and straight in the high country of the Colorado Plateau and the White Mountains, its bark plated in orange-brown sections that smell, in warm weather, faintly of vanilla. In November, the warmth is gone, and the smell is simpler, wood and cold, and the faint resinous quality that belongs to every pine forest in every season. The trees at Turkey Springs were old enough to be substantial, close enough together in the unthinned sections to limit sight lines, the kind of tree cover that makes a forest feel like an interior space, even when there is no ceiling. The sky above the clearing was the main exception to this, a wide open patch of Arizona sky in the last of the November light, the kind of sky that belongs to high elevation in a western state, clear and very large, the stars becoming visible at the edges as the light continued to fail. By the time the crew loaded into the truck, the usable working light was nearly done. Sunset times for that date and location in Arizona placed the end of direct sunlight at approximately 5:30 to 6 in the evening, not a guess, but a calculable astronomical fact consistent with the timeline the Navajo County Sheriff's Department would later record. The sky above the clearing at Turkey Springs was still holding some light when Rogers started the engine, the orange at the western tree line not yet dark, the trees on the eastern side of the site already in shadow. The cold had been building through the afternoon, the November air at high elevation in Arizona, carrying a specific quality of dryness and clarity, the kind of cold that makes sounds carry farther and makes the inside of a truck cab feel like a significant improvement on the outside world. 7 men in a single truck is a specific arrangement. The cab of a work truck carries some of them, and the truck bed carries others, and whoever is in the bed on a cold November evening in the mountains is aware, with the particular clarity of discomfort, of the air moving at road speed and the temperature dropping as the light goes. Rogers at the wheel, the engine turning over in the cold. The headlights, if they were on yet, casting their particular pale rectangles onto the packed dirt surface of the forest road. The truck pulling out of the clearing and onto the track between the trees, the work site diminishing behind it, the stacked timber, the stumps, the open sky above the clearing, becoming a visible patch of fading light through the rear window, and then gone behind the first bend in the road. The road from Turkey Springs toward Heber and then toward Snowflake runs through the kind of forest that does not provide landmarks. The ponderosa pines on both sides of the track are more or less the same tree, repeated across the landscape, the same orange-brown trunks, the same high canopy, the same intervals of open ground between them that are never quite open enough to see very far. The road itself is the only line through it, the only thing that distinguishes one stretch of forest from another, and in the failing light of a November evening, the road visible ahead of the truck's headlights is all the information the forest road offers. Behind the truck, the road is immediately dark. On both sides, the trees close in to the edge of the track. Above, through the narrow corridor of sky between the canopy, the color continues to drain from the day. The drive from the Turkey Springs site toward the highway was the kind of drive that is entirely ordinary in the way that daily commutes in remote places are ordinary, not pleasant necessarily, but familiar. The same road made at the same time of day for weeks, the trees and the turns known well enough that the mind can find other things to do while the body handles the mechanics of the journey. The men in the truck had spent a long day at physical work in cold air at high elevation. The warmth of the cab relative to the temperature outside would have been the most immediately felt thing, the engine noise. The slight vibration of the unpaved road surface through the frame of the vehicle. These are the ordinary textures of the end of a working day in a remote place, and on most days they are the whole story. The Apache-Sitgreaves covers enough ground that the drive from any given work site within it to the nearest paved road can take a meaningful amount of time. The track through the trees covering the miles at the modest speed that unpaved mountain roads in variable condition require. The road north and then west from Turkey Springs toward Heber was that kind of road, packed dirt where the surface was good, loose rock where the conditions were less predictable, the grades and bends determined by the terrain rather than by any particular engineering consideration, the whole thing passable but never comfortable at speed. In November, with the light going quickly and the temperature dropping, the road called for attention. Rogers driving, the trees on both sides. What the forest around Turkey Springs looks like from inside a moving vehicle, on a road through dense ponderosa pine in the failing light of a November evening, is worth holding for a moment. The trees on both sides of the track create a visual effect that anyone who has driven through dense forest at dusk will know. The trees nearest the road moving past quickly in the peripheral vision, the trees farther back moving more slowly, the ones farthest visible moving barely at all, the whole mass of the forest seeming to rotate around the vehicle as it moves. In the headlights, if the headlights were on, the nearest trees catch the light on their trunks and throw the background into relative darkness, creating a kind of tunnel effect, lit foreground, dark middle ground. The trees at the edge of visibility, resolving slowly out of shadow and then passing back into it. This is ordinary. This is what a forest road at dusk looks like. There is nothing unusual in the description. It is simply what was there. The USFS thinning contract, that brought the crew to Turkey Springs was in its nature one of many such contracts awarded across the Apache-Sitgreaves in a given year. The forest's 2 million acres require ongoing management, and the work of selective clearing, removing smaller trees to reduce competition and fire risk, improving the overall health of the forest by thinning the stand, is documented in USFS land management records as a routine element of the agency's stewardship approach. The contract Rogers held specified a section of forest, a scope of work, and a deadline by which the work was to be completed. It was an administrative document in the ordinary sense, a record of an agreement between a government agency and a private contractor, both parties expecting the terms to be fulfilled in the normal way of such things. The paperwork existed. Rogers's name was on it. The work was being done. Snowflake, Arizona, in 1975, was small enough that 7 men from the same community working the same logging contract would have been known, at least by name, to a significant portion of the town's population. The community sits on the Colorado Plateau at an elevation of approximately 5,600 feet. Its streets laid out in the particular grid that Mormon settlement patterns favored when the town was founded in the 1870s, wide enough for a team of oxen to turn around, the story goes, though by 1975 the width served mainly to give the streets a spacious, unhurried quality at odds with the compressed grid of cities farther south. The water tower was visible from the approaches to town. The buildings were low against the sky. From a distance, approaching from the northeast on the road from Heber, Snowflake at night would have appeared as a cluster of lit windows against the darker mass of the plateau, the kind of community that announces itself modestly through its lights rather than through any impressive structure or skyline. The 30 miles between Snowflake and the Turkey Springs worksite were 30 miles of the specific western landscape that occupies the space between high desert communities in Arizona. Plateau country giving way to mountain country, the elevation rising, the vegetation shifting from the lower desert scrub to the pinon and juniper of the middle elevations, and then to the ponderosa pine of the high country. The drive was long enough to be worth making only when the work at the other end justified it, and the USFS contract justified it. Rogers's crew had been making that drive in both directions for weeks. By November 5th, the road between Snowflake and Turkey Springs was known to all of them. The cold at Turkey Springs on November 5th was the cold of high elevation in the Arizona mountains in autumn, a dry cold distinct from the damp cold of lower elevations in other climates, the kind of cold that makes the stars bright and the air clear and the inside of a truck cab an immediately appreciable environment. The men who had been riding in the truck bed for part of the drive would have felt it more directly. Those in the cab would have felt the inadequacy of the heater in the first minutes after the engine started, the cab temperature rising slowly towards something that could be described as warm relative to outside, if not warm in any absolute sense. These are ordinary physical facts of the situation: the cold November air, the truck cab warming slowly, the road ahead unreeling in the headlights between the dark stands of ponderosa pine. What the Turkey Springs clearing looked like as the crew drove away from it, the cut timber stacked at the margins, the stumps at ground level, the open rectangle of sky above turning from orange to a deeper color as the light continued to fail, is the kind of image that accumulates meaning only in retrospect, the way that ordinary ending points do. A workday ending, a clearing left behind, the same clearing the crew had left behind at the end of each previous workday, now one day's work further along in the process of completing the contract. From the perspective available to anyone in that truck on that road at that moment, There was nothing to distinguish the Turkey Springs clearing on November 5th, 1975, from any previous version of itself at the end of any previous workday. The trees had been thinned, the timber had been stacked. The crew was heading home. The Forest Service contract with its specific language, plot numbers, acreage, deadline, the technical description of selective thinning, and what it required, represented a kind of official notation of the work being done. Government land management agreements of this kind create a paper trail, each element of the contract a documented fact: who held it, what it specified, where the work was to be done, when it was due. The Turkey Springs section of the Apache-Sitgreaves is noted in USFS land maps of the region, the location fixed by geographic coordinates and survey references in the way that federal land management agencies fix locations, precisely with enough redundancy that the same point can be found by anyone consulting the same maps. The work site was real in this documentary sense. The contract was real. The men were real. The clearing existed, and the road existed, and the truck existed, and on the evening of November 5th, all of these things were as they had been on every previous evening of the contract's duration. Rogers drove. The road turned through the trees in the way that unpaved forest roads turn, not according to any plan, but according to the landscape, following the path of least resistance through the terrain, curving around the larger grades, and the places where the ground was too soft or too broken for a road to hold. The headlights, by this point fully necessary, illuminated the section of road immediately ahead of the truck and the first several ranks of trees on both sides, and very little beyond that. The forest at night close to the road is the forest in full detail. Bark texture, low branches, the occasional ground-level debris of fallen wood, and pine needle accumulation. The forest slightly farther back is shadow, the trees resolving into shapes rather than surfaces. The forest at the edge of the headlight's reach is mostly dark, the outlines of the nearest trees visible against it, but the space behind them not. The distance from Turkey Springs to Heber was approximately 15 to 20 miles by the forest road, and from Heber the paved road continued to Snowflake. The entire route from the work site to the community where most of the crew lived represented, at driving speed on those roads, an evening commute of perhaps an hour or somewhat more depending on conditions. The crew had made this drive before. They would make it again. On the evening of November 5th, the truck was on the road home, the same road home it had always been, the forest on both sides continuous and dark and full of the particular quiet that dense ponderosa pine country holds. After the working sounds stop, the cold of the November air outside the truck was a stable fact. The temperature at high elevation in the Apache-Sitgreaves in November drops to a point that makes the cab of the truck a genuinely welcome environment. The glass of the windows cold to the touch, the heater running. The sky above the narrow corridor of road, visible between the canopy on both sides, had completed the transition from pale orange to something darker, not quite fully dark. At that hour, the last western light, still holding a faint quality of color at the horizon, but dark enough that the stars were present in the parts of the sky, clear of cloud. The ponderosa pines on both sides were at their most uniform and least remarkable, standing in the way they always stood, the road running between them, toward the highway and the town, and the end of the working day. On that road, in that truck, in the last of the November light, with the headlights picking out the packed dirt of the track ahead, and the trees on both sides, unchanged from any other stretch of the same road, there was nothing yet to record. The day had been what it was. The work had been what it was. The crew of 7 men was making the same drive they had made at the end of each previous working day. The Turkey Springs clearing now several minutes behind them, the highway and Heber somewhere ahead in the dark, the forest on both sides unlit and unbroken. The unpaved road continued. The headlights lit it in the way that headlights light unpaved roads. The surface pale and detailed in the direct beam, the edges softening into shadow. The road itself the only clear thing in the darkening world on all sides. The trees on the left side of the track stood close to the verge. The trees on the right side stood at a similar distance. Above, the sky between the canopy was dark enough now that the stars were fully there. The high elevation Arizona sky at night, carrying more stars than most people from lower elevations expect, the atmosphere thin enough, and the light pollution from the nearest town far enough away that the stars were not points of light, so much as a presence, a general brightness in the darkness above the tree line. Rogers held the wheel. The engine made the sound that engines make on unpaved roads, slightly more work than smooth asphalt requires, the frame carrying the slight vibration of the loose surface through the seats. The men in the truck carried the quiet of men at the end of a physical workday, the particular quality of tired that belongs to outdoor labor in cold air, not an unpleasant state in the main, but not an alert one. The road ahead disappeared into the dark beyond the headlights' reach, in the way that roads always disappear beyond the reach of headlights on dark nights in forests, a foreshortened world, lit and specific for a short distance, and then simply not visible beyond that point. There was nothing yet to explain. The forest was the forest. The road was the road. The truck was a truck on an unpaved track through a large documented, mapped, and managed section of the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest, carrying 7 named men from a Turkey Springs worksite towards Snowflake, Arizona, at the end of an ordinary November workday. The Turkey Springs clearing was behind them in the dark. The highway was ahead of them in the dark. The trees on both sides of the road were the ponderosa pines of the White Mountains, standing as they had always stood, their trunks catching the edge of the headlights briefly, and then passing back into shadow. The road turned. The trees held their positions on both sides. The sky above the corridor of the road was dark and very large and full of stars. The headlights reached forward a certain distance and stopped. Beyond that distance, the road continued, packed dirt and loose rock and the familiar turns through the familiar forest, and whatever was ahead on that road was in the dark, and there was nothing yet to say about it. The truck stopped on the forest road at approximately the point where the trees thinned on the right side and opened into a clearing. The headlights were still on. The engine was still running. What the crew reported seeing through the windshield and the side windows of that stopped vehicle has been on record at the Navajo County Sheriff's Department since the night of November 5th, 1975. Mike Rogers was at the wheel. The other 5 men were arranged in the cab and the truck bed, the way they had been arranged for the drive home from Turkey Springs, the same configuration as any other workday, ending on any other forest road in the Apache-Sitgreaves. What changed was what the headlights showed, and then what became visible beyond the headlights, in the clearing to the right of the road. Something was there. The crew could see it through the glass. The truck did not move. The object they described was disc-shaped. It was large enough to be visible at the distance between the road and the clearing's far edge. It was hovering at low altitude, not resting on the ground, not moving through the sky in any directional trajectory, but staying in one position above the clearing floor, held there by whatever mechanism it operated on, which none of the men could account for then, and none of them has been able to account for in the decades of recorded statements since. The light it gave off was described consistently across the crew's individual statements as yellowish or golden, filling the clearing with a quality of illumination that was distinct from the truck's headlights, warmer, more diffuse, coming from the object itself rather than projecting from a point. 6 men in a stopped truck on a dark forest road looking at something in a clearing. That is the frame the record begins in. The engine idled, the light of the object held steady in the gap between the trees on the road's right side, visible through the windshield, undeniable in the particularity of what it looked like, even if what it was remained entirely without a category. The crew's individual statements, collected separately by the Navajo County Sheriff's Department in the hours and days following the incident, show a notable consistency on the basic descriptive elements of what they saw. The object was disc-shaped. The light it emitted was golden or yellowish. It was hovering at a low altitude above the clearing. These elements appear in statement after statement with a consistency that the examining investigators noted at the time, a consistency that has remained a feature of the case as it has been discussed in investigative literature from November 1975 to the present. Accounts differ on smaller particulars, precise size, precise height, the exact quality of the sound, if any, that the object produced, the basic shape, the light, the position above the clearing. Those hold across the record with unusual steadiness. It was Travis Walton who opened the truck door. The accounts given by crew members suggest that at least some of the other men voiced concern or made some attempt to discourage him. Walton himself has described the decision across 30 years of published accounts and documented interviews with a consistent honesty about its nature. It was not considered. It was impulsive. The craft was there. It was visible, and something in him moved toward it before any calculation about risk or caution had time to form. He stepped down from the truck onto the packed dirt of the forest road. His boots were on the ground. The truck's headlights were behind him. The glow of the object was ahead. The distance between his feet and the truck began to grow with each step he took across the open ground. What is documented in the Sheriff's Department record is the movement itself, a man leaving a stopped vehicle on a forest road and walking toward an unidentified object in a clearing at night. What Walton has described across his published accounts is the quality of that approach, the light growing as he crossed the distance, the scale of the object becoming more present and more definite as he got closer, the whole scene working on him with the particular force that things work on us when we are moving toward them without having stopped to decide whether to do so. The other 6 men in and around the truck watched him go. Roger's hands were still on the wheel. The engine ran. Walton was perhaps 20 feet from the craft, as best the witnesses could estimate, when the object produced a sound. The descriptions across different statements vary slightly. Some accounts describe a low mechanical rumbling or vibration. Others note a higher frequency quality. Some describe a change in the light's intensity in the moments preceding what came next. What all of the statements agree on is the sequence. The object shifted in some audible or visible way, and then it emitted something. The beam, or bolt, was described as bluish-green. It came from the craft. It traveled the short distance to where Walton was standing in the clearing, and it struck him. The witnesses in the truck reported seeing him thrown backward by the impact, lifted off his feet, by some accounts, or knocked violently back and down, landing on the ground and remaining motionless. The word they used across the various statements is consistent. He was down. He was not moving. He was on the ground, between them and the craft was still there above the clearing, and what had just happened had happened in a matter of seconds, on a dark November forest road where there had been no preparation for it and no framework available to process it while it was still occurring. Rogers put the truck in gear. The record is clear on this. The remaining 6 men departed the scene. The forest road unrolled in the headlights, the same packed dirt and loose rock it had been on the way out to Turkey Springs that morning, and the truck moved through it at a speed that the crew has described as fast, not measured, not considered, but the speed of people who had just watched something happen to one of their number and had no map for what to do next. The trees closed in on both sides of the road. The clearing fell away behind them. Walton was gone from their sight. The drive away from the clearing lasted minutes before some combination of whatever had just happened and whatever they might be leaving behind became insupportable. The crew's accounts differ slightly on the exact timing and the precise sequence of argument or discussion that followed Rogers's initial departure, but the outcome is documented. The truck returned to the clearing. Rogers brought it back up the forest road and stopped again in approximately the same position, headlights pointing at the same gap in the tree line on the right side of the road, the same angle on the clearing that had shown them the object and then shown them Walton crossing the ground toward it. The clearing was empty. The object was not there. Walton was not there. The ponderosa pines stood in their ordinary positions, the same trees that had framed the clearing on 3 sides when the object had been hovering inside it, now framing nothing. The ground was undisturbed, insofar as the crew could determine from the road in the dark, with the truck's headlights as the only source of light. Whatever had been there, the craft, its golden light, the presence it had occupied in that particular gap between the trees, was absent, and the man who had walked from the truck toward it was absent with it. 6 men returned to an empty clearing and found nothing that explained the 10 or 15 minutes that had just passed on a dark forest road in the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest. The search that was possible with what they had, headlights, voices calling into the dark, whatever could be assessed from the edge of the clearing before the forest closed off further visibility, produced nothing. The ground did not show evidence of where Walton had fallen or where he had gone from there. The object had left no mark on the clearing floor that the crew could identify in the dark with the light available to them. There was the forest, and there was the road, and there was the fact of one man being absent when the truck held 6. The nearest telephone was not close. Turkey Springs was in one of the genuinely remote stretches of the Apache-Sitgreaves, 20 miles northeast of Heber, by the kind of unpaved forest road that made every mile longer than it would have been on a paved highway, and 30 miles from Snowflake by a route that offered no passing traffic, no houses, no lit windows against which the darkness of the drive might have been measured. The crew drove through all of it. The road ran ahead in the headlights, the same road it had been for every workday of the Turkey Springs contract, and none of the men inside the truck had anything that could be placed around what had happened in that clearing to make it smaller or more comprehensible. At approximately 7:30 in the evening of November 5th, 1975, a call was placed to the Navajo County Sheriff's Department reporting what the crew had witnessed. The Sheriff's Department's records document the time of that call, establishing it as the first point of official contact with the case, the moment the clearing and the object and the man who had walked toward it became part of a formal record rather than something that had happened only to the people who had been present. The interval between the incident on the forest road and the call to the sheriff's office was approximately 90 minutes. 90 minutes of dark forest road and the particular quality of silence that accumulates in a vehicle full of people who are trying to account for something they do not have the language for. The crew told the dispatcher what they had seen, 6 working men from Snowflake and the surrounding area logging contractors at the end of a documented workday, reporting to the Navajo County Sheriff's Department that they had stopped their truck on a forest road, that one of their number had left the truck and crossed the ground toward an object hovering in a clearing, and that a beam of light had struck that man and knocked him down, and that when they returned to the clearing, both the object and the man were gone. This is what the record holds. This is what was said into a telephone at 7:30 p.m. on a November evening in 1975, and what was written down by whoever received the call, and what became the beginning of a case file that has never been formally closed. The statements the 6 men gave to the Navajo County Sheriff's Department in the hours and days that followed show the kind of internal consistency that investigators note and continue to note across decades of cases. Not identical accounts, the exact phrasing differs. The specific sensory details vary in the way that honest, independent recollections of the same event tend to vary. But accounts that agree on the central sequence, the disc-shaped craft, the golden light, the beam, the fall, the empty clearing. Dwayne Smith gave his statement. John Goulet gave his. Ken Peterson, Alan Dallas, Steve Pierce. Each of them sat down with investigators and described what they had seen from inside or near that stopped truck on the Turkey Springs Road. And the descriptions that emerged from those separate sessions hold a shape that has remained the same across every subsequent retelling. The crew was placed under considerable pressure in the immediate aftermath of their report. The Navajo County Sheriff's Department was operating simultaneously with a missing persons case and a potential homicide investigation, treating the 6 men as possible suspects, while also organizing the ground search of the Turkey Springs area that would proceed in the following days. These are not comfortable conditions. Being questioned about the disappearance of a man one worked with, in circumstances that no one has a ready explanation for, under the specific legal framing of a homicide investigation, is a form of pressure with its own particular weight. The 6 men sustained their accounts. Mike Rogers, whose logging contract with the United States Forest Service had brought the crew to Turkey Springs in the first place, gave his account of the evening. He had been driving. He had stopped the truck. He had seen what the others had seen through the windshield. He had driven away and then returned. He had been in the cab of the truck for the entire sequence of events, hands on the wheel, with a view of the clearing and the object and Walton's approach across the ground that was as direct and unobstructed as any view available from that road at that hour. His account aligned with those of the other 5. The object that the crew described was not a known aircraft type. The flight characteristics they reported, hovering at low altitude without visible propulsion, the quality and color of the light it emitted, the production of the beam that struck Walton, have no match in the documented capabilities of any aircraft, experimental or otherwise, that was operating in Arizona in November 1975. This is a statement about the record, not a statement about what the object was. What the crew described does not match anything in the catalog of known aircraft. The gap between the description and the catalog is a feature of the case. It is not by itself an explanation. The forest was quiet when the crew drove away from Turkey Springs for the second and final time that night. The trees were what they had been for the entire day of work, ponderosa pines standing in the density characteristic of the high elevation sections of the Apache-Sitgreaves, the November cold settling into the spaces between them as the night deepened, the road holding its packed dirt surface ahead of the headlights with the same neutrality it had held all day. There was no wind reported. The sky above the tree line, where it was visible, was clear. The conditions were ordinary, in the way that conditions remain ordinary after the thing that has disrupted them has passed, the forest returning to itself with a completeness that left nothing to show what had been there except the testimony of 6 men in a truck on a road driving toward the nearest telephone they could reach. The call to the Navajo County Sheriff's Department produced a response. Investigators drove the dark miles to Turkey Springs. The sheriff's office began the formal machinery of a missing persons investigation, and the Turkey Springs clearing received its first law enforcement attention before the night of November 5th was over. Flashlights and boots where there had been headlights, and the crew's voices, the same ground, the same surrounding ponderosa pines, and the same absence at the center of whatever had happened there. The initial law enforcement response to the site found what the crew had found when they returned. No object, no Walton, no physical trace of either. The clearing was empty. It remained empty. What was established in those first hours is what the record continues to hold as its bedrock. 6 men gave consistent accounts of an event on a forest road. One man who had been with them at the start of the drive home was not with them at its end. The object they described had not been identified. The clearing, when searched, produced nothing that explained the gap between the crew's departure from the Turkey Springs site and the call to the sheriff's office at 7:30 p.m. The case began in the space that those facts create. When placed side by side, the documented reality of 6 men and their accounts, and the documented absence of the 7th, and nothing in between that the record or the investigation could fill in. The Turkey Springs Road at night, with law enforcement now moving through it, and the crew somewhere in the process of giving statements in a Navajo County interview room, was the same road it had been when Rogers first drove out toward the clearing and stopped the truck. The headlights of the investigators' vehicles swept the same tree line. The ponderosa pines held their positions on both sides of the unpaved road, with the indifference of things that have been standing in the same place for a long time and will continue to do so regardless of what occurs on the road between them. The clearing, when the lights found it again, was open ground. The sky above it held nothing. 6 accounts, collected separately, each describing the same disc-shaped craft emitting a golden light in a clearing on a forest road in east-central Arizona. A beam of bluish-green light, a man knocked to the ground, a truck that left and returned, a clearing that held nothing when the truck came back. These are the elements the Sheriff's Department record begins with, not the interpretation of them, not the conclusions anyone drew from them, but the elements themselves, sitting in the formal language of written statements from 6 witnesses who had been present on the Turkey Springs Road when the dusk settled into dark on November 5th, 1975. The statements held those elements in place. The clearing held nothing else. Travis Walton was somewhere between those 2 facts, and the forest was quiet on all sides, and the question of where had no answer the record could locate. There is something in the specific quality of the crew's consistency worth dwelling in, not as an argument for or against any interpretation of the events they described, but as a documented feature of the case worth understanding clearly. 6 men who worked together in the physical conditions of a USFS logging contract, close quarters work, the kind of labor that develops a particular familiarity between people. Days in the same forest, on the same road, doing the same task with the same equipment, gave accounts that held the same shape across separate interviews, under pressure, over time. The consistency is part of what the record is. It is not proof of anything beyond the consistency itself, but it is present, and it has been noted by investigators and researchers across the 50 years the case has been examined, and its presence in the record is not a small thing, even if it is not a final one. The drive from Turkey Springs to wherever the crew reached a telephone was approximately 50 miles by the routes available from that section of the forest. 50 miles of unpaved forest road, giving way eventually to state highway, the distance covered in darkness, the cab of the truck holding 6 men, and everything that had just happened on the road behind them. No one in the truck had an explanation. No one in the truck has produced one in the decades since. What they had was the account, the same shape, the same core details, and the absence at the center of it where Travis Walton had been standing when the forest road still held all 7 of them. The Navajo County Sheriff's Department received the call. The case opened. The clearing, 12 miles from Heber and 30 from Snowflake, stood empty in the dark, with the ponderosa pines around it, and the November sky above it. The object that had been there, no longer there, the ground beneath where it had hovered, offering nothing to the investigators who would comb it in the days to come, nothing that marked or measured or explained what had occupied that space above the forest floor before it was gone. The crew's truck was somewhere on a dark Arizona road when the clock in the sheriff's department showed 7:30 p.m. The call was being placed, the case was becoming a record, and the clearing was empty, the way a thing is empty when what filled it has departed without leaving a trace, not disturbed, not altered, not marked, but holding the particular quality of a place where something was and is no longer. That quality, the specific silence of an absence that cannot be accounted for, is where the documented record of the evening of November 5th, 1975, reaches its edge. The crew had been there. They had described what they saw. The statements existed. The case file was beginning to accumulate pages, and the clearing at Turkey Springs with the ponderosa pines around it and the cold November air above the open ground held only what had been there before the crew stopped the truck that evening and looked through the glass at the light in the trees. The road that Rogers had driven out along, and then driven back along, and then driven away from, for the final time that night, the same packed dirt forest road that the USFS thinning contract had made familiar over weeks of daily travel, disappeared ahead into the unlit trees and continued on into the dark miles between Turkey, Springs, and anywhere that had a telephone, a law enforcement office, a record that could hold what 6 men were trying to describe from a stopped vehicle on the Turkey Springs road. The truck moved. The forest moved past on both sides. The clearing fell behind. And somewhere between the place where the truck had stopped and the place where Walton had been standing when the beam of light reached him, the record runs out. Not because no one was watching. 6 people were watching. Not because the accounts are absent. They are on file in the formal language of Sheriff's Department interview records, where they have been since November 1975. The record runs out because what it contains is exactly what the crew reported, and no more. An object in a clearing, a man who crossed the ground toward it, a beam of light, a fall, and then an empty clearing with the forest standing quiet and undisturbed on all sides, and 1 man absent, and no explanation for any of it anywhere in the trees or the ground or the cold November sky above the Turkey Springs road. The clearing was there. It is documented. The crew was there. That is documented too. What the record holds, and holds with the particular stubbornness of things that cannot be revised because they are already in writing, is the simple, unresolved fact of a man who had been standing on a forest road and then was not. The forest was quiet. The night was deep and cold and entirely without explanation. The trees stood where they had always stood. The ground was still. and the clearing, open and empty under the November sky, continued to exist in the same indifferent way that cleared ground continues to exist when the thing that occupied it is gone, present, undisturbed, holding the shape of the space where something had been, with nothing left inside it to show what that something was. On the morning of November 6th, 1975, search teams assembled at the edge of the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest near Turkey Springs, their breath visible in the cold air, the ponderosa pines standing in the early light as they had stood the night before, indifferent to whatever had or had not passed among them. The ground was dry, the sky was pale and clear. There was no physical evidence at the clearing to explain the absence of one man from a crew of 7, and so the search began the way searches begin, methodically, on foot, moving through the trees in a grid, calling a name into the quiet forest, and hearing nothing come back. The search that followed was organized and documented. Navajo County Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Under Sheriff Ken Copeland had responded to the crew's call the previous evening, conducted their first round of interviews with all 6 remaining men, and by the following morning had arranged for search teams to move through the Turkey Springs area. Law enforcement personnel, search and rescue volunteers, people who knew the terrain and knew how to work it. They came prepared for the kind of thing a search team is prepared for. They moved through the trees, looking for signs of a man who had left a truck on a forest road and had not come back. What they found was the same thing in every direction: undisturbed ground, standing timber, the ordinary silence of a high country forest in November. The Turkey Springs area is dense. The ponderosa pines there grow close enough that the light between trunks falls in long intervals, and the forest floor in November carries the accumulated dry needles of seasons past, soft underfoot in places, crackling in others, the kind of surface that holds the impression of a boot for a day or two before the wind and the cold erase it. Search teams working that terrain in the days following November 5th found no impressions, no clothing, no equipment, no sign that a man had moved through the trees in any direction from the point on the road where the crew said he had last been seen. The absence was total and unremarkable, which is to say, it resembled nothing so much as a forest that had simply never held the person being searched for. The cold was a factor. November in that part of Arizona, at elevation, is not a gentle month. Daytime temperatures in the White Mountains in early November can drop into the 30s, and nights are colder. A man on foot in the forest, without shelter, without water, without knowing where he was, would not survive indefinitely. Search teams working through the days following November 5th understood the timeline. The urgency was real, if quiet, documented in the daily logs of a search that kept returning to the same clearing and the same empty ground. Navajo County Sheriff's Office was a small-town operation in 1975, as most rural Arizona County law enforcement was, a building in Holbrook staffed by people who knew the communities they served, knew the terrain, and were not accustomed to investigations that had no ready category. Marlon Gillespie had a missing persons case. He also had 6 men whose account of what had happened did not match any investigative framework he could apply to it in a straightforward way. The interviews he and Under Sheriff Copeland conducted with the crew in the days following November 5th were careful and thorough, the kind of interviews conducted with people who were simultaneously witnesses and the only available persons of interest in a case involving a missing man. The pressure that put on 6 logging workers from Snowflake was not small. The sheriff's department had opened the case on 2 tracks simultaneously, a missing persons investigation and a potential homicide inquiry. This was the appropriate response, given what law enforcement had: a man gone, a group of people present at the time of his disappearance, a location too remote for any independent witness to have seen anything. The crew understood the weight of that dual framing. They had reported what they reported, and what they reported was strange enough that investigating officers had no ready mechanism for evaluating it. All 6 men were interviewed. All 6 men were asked to account for the evening of November 5th in detail. Their accounts were consistent with each other in the ways that mattered, and varied in the small ways that individual recollections of a shared event tend to vary. None of that resolved anything. The investigation continued. Travis Walton was not in the forest. News of the incident moved quickly for a remote rural story in 1975. Within days of the disappearance, reports had appeared in regional Arizona newspapers, the kind of local coverage that comes when a law enforcement agency is actively looking for a missing man, and the circumstances are unusual enough to interest a reporter on a county beat. From regional newspapers, the story moved to wire services, and from wire services to national outlets. By the time the first week of the investigation was underway, the Travis Walton disappearance had become a story people in other parts of the country were reading about at their kitchen tables. The National Enquirer, then one of the highest circulation publications in America, would eventually carry the story to millions of readers who had no prior knowledge of Snowflake, Arizona, or the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest. In Snowflake itself, opinion divided along lines that were more personal than ideological. The people who knew Mike Rogers and Travis Walton and the rest of the crew who had worked alongside them, gone to school with some of them, bought things from the same hardware store, attended the same churches, many of those people found the crew credible, not because they had evaluated the evidence, but because they knew the men. They knew whether these were people given to elaborate fabrication, whether there was the kind of distance between their character and their stated experience that would have indicated something false. Other people in the community were skeptical for the same personal reasons. They knew someone who knew someone, and what they heard through that chain did not sit right with them. Both responses were recorded in contemporaneous newspaper accounts from the period, held side by side without resolution. The way community opinion usually holds competing versions of an event that has not been explained. The forest search continued through the first several days of November. The teams worked the Turkey Springs area and the surrounding terrain, moving out from the clearing where the crew said Walton had last been standing, working the grid in multiple directions. Search and rescue teams trained in high country Arizona wilderness found no trace. Law enforcement personnel found no trace. The ground around the clearing held no evidence of a struggle, a fall, a departure on foot in any direction. The clearing itself, when investigators examined it, was simply a clearing, a section of forest floor from which smaller trees had been removed by the thinning operation, the cut material stacked at the margins, the open ground between the standing ponderosa pines, undisturbed and empty. Whatever the crew had described seeing there the night before had left no physical signature that investigation could identify. Days passed. The search continued. The 6 crew members remained in contact with the sheriff's department, remained in Snowflake, remained under the particular pressure of being the last people known to have seen Travis Walton and having told a story about that last sighting that no investigating officer had a ready framework for. The days accumulated, 1, 2, 3, 4, and with each passing day, the search teams found the same thing they had found on the first morning: the forest, the cold, the ordinary silence of the trees, and no man. There is something particular about the quality of a prolonged search that finds nothing. In the first hours, the absence seems temporary. The person is somewhere. The terrain is large. The search will turn something up. As hours become days, the quality of the absence shifts. The nothing being found stops feeling like a result waiting to be corrected and starts feeling like a fact in its own right. The Turkey Springs search, working through the first days of November 1975, moved through that shift. By the time 3 days had passed and then 4, the investigators and search teams working the case were sitting with an absence that the terrain had consistently refused to explain. The media attention brought its own complications to an investigation already without a clear framework. Reporters asking questions of law enforcement in the days after the disappearance were not asking questions that had simple answers, and the investigation was ongoing and open in ways that made the release of information careful and measured. The 6 crew members were not speaking freely to the press during the investigation. They were in contact with law enforcement, some of them under significant legal pressure, and their situation was not one that encouraged extended public statements. The story moved through the press without the crew members at its center, which meant it moved through a kind of factual vacancy. Reporters writing about a disappearance none of them could explain, quoting sources none of them had full access to, filling the space around a case that had not resolved. In the evenings, after the search teams had come out of the forest, the days settled back into the ordinary rhythms of a small Arizona community trying to absorb an extraordinary reported event. Snowflake in November 1975 was a quiet place, wide streets, low buildings, the Colorado Plateau open and cold around it, the White Mountains visible on the horizon to the northeast. Somewhere out there in the dark, the Turkey Springs clearing still empty, the search still formally ongoing, the question of Travis Walton's whereabouts still entirely without an answer. People went home, people ate dinner, people talked or did not talk about what had happened or what they thought had happened, the conversation folding back into itself the way conversations about unresolved things tend to do, and the days kept passing. On the night of November 10th, 1975, 5 days after the crew's truck had stopped on a forest road in the Apache-Sitgreaves, a phone rang in the home of Grant Neff. Grant Neff was Travis Walton's brother-in-law, and the voice on the phone was Travis Walton's. The call came from a payphone at a gas station in Heber, Arizona, a small community approximately 12 miles southwest of Snowflake on the road between the forest country and the plateau. The call was brief. Walton was there. Walton was alive. And then Neff and Walton's brother Dwayne were in a car driving the short distance from Snowflake to Heber, headlights on the dark Arizona road, covering the 12 miles between the town and the gas station in the kind of focused, urgent quiet that descends when a person who has been absent for 5 days is suddenly, without explanation, 12 miles away and reachable. They found him at the gas station. The accounts that describe what Neff and Dwayne Walton found when they arrived at the Heber station describe a man in a physically distressed state, disoriented, confused, not entirely coherent. The kind of confusion that comes not from one bad night, but from something more sustained and more dislocating. He was alive. He was there. The 5 days between the moment the crew had driven away from the Turkey Springs clearing and the moment the phone rang in Grant Neff's house had ended, and Travis Walton was standing at a gas station in Heber, Arizona, holding a payphone receiver in a lit booth visible from the road, and the 5 days were not over so much as they had simply stopped, without explanation, at this unremarkable location 12 miles from home. The drive back to Snowflake was quiet, by the accounts that describe it. Walton was not in a condition to give a coherent account of where he had been or what had happened to him, not that night, not in the immediate hours of his return. What the family had on the night of November 10th was the physical fact of his presence, his distress, and the interval between his disappearance and his reappearance, which sat at 5 days and refused to shrink or expand, no matter how it was approached. The investigation that had been ongoing since November 5th now had a living person at its center again, rather than an absence. What that living person could say about the 5 days, and what it would mean when he said it, was still to come. A medical examination was conducted shortly after Walton's return. The examination produced findings that have been cited in investigative accounts of the case from the period through subsequent decades, findings that were careful and limited and did not explain anything, but that anchored the duration of the disappearance in something measurable. The examination noted signs consistent with dehydration. It noted findings consistent with a reduced caloric intake sustained over several days. Ornate. It noted an absence of injuries consistent with prolonged physical assault or with exposure to the elements over a 5-day period in November at elevation, and it noted beard growth, 5 days worth of growth, a biological fact, small and concrete, and in the end more durable than many of the other elements of the case, a clock that had kept running somewhere during the days the search teams walked the Turkey Springs forest and found nothing, and whose record was legible on Travis Walton's face when he was found at the gas station in Heber. The beard is a small thing to fix on. It is not the most dramatic element of the case or the most significant one, but it is the kind of detail that sits with particular weight because it admits no interpretation. It is not a statement, not a memory, not a perception that could be influenced by expectation or desire or confusion. 5 days of growth is 5 days of growth. It does not expand to account for an alternative explanation. It does not contract because an investigation needs it to. It sits in the record of the case as a quiet, persistent fact about the duration of an absence that the investigation had not been able to explain from the outside, and whose explanation from the inside was still, in the days following November 10th, largely unavailable. The medical findings noted in connection with the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization's subsequent review of the case described a picture consistent with the passage of 5 days under conditions that had not involved normal eating, normal drinking, or normal physical activity. The absence of injuries consistent with sustained physical assault meant the examination could not easily support a scenario in which Walton had been held somewhere against his will in ordinary physical circumstances and had simply hidden or been hidden. The dehydration and reduced caloric intake were consistent with the duration of the absence, but not explanatory of its cause. What the examination provided was a frame, 5 days, this level of physical effect, without filling in what had happened inside the frame. In the days following Walton's return, the Sheriff's Department investigation shifted. The missing persons case had resolved in the most basic sense. The person was no longer missing. The homicide inquiry was set aside. What remained was a disappearance whose circumstances had been reported by 7 people, whose 5-day duration had been documented by a search that found nothing, and whose ending had been a phone call from a gas station 12 miles from the point of origin, made by a man who was alive and present, and for the moment unable to say much about what had come between. The investigators had statements from the 6 crew members collected in the days immediately after November 5th. They now had Walton himself. The record they assembled in the period following his return has been cited, reviewed, and contested in the decades since, held as evidence by some and questioned by others. Sitting in the Navajo County Sheriff's Department files is the documented record of a November night and the 5 days that followed. The community of Snowflake absorbed the return as it had absorbed the disappearance, through conversation, through personal knowledge of the people involved, through the particular social process of a small town deciding what it thinks about something it cannot explain. Some people found Walton's return and his physical condition and the consistency of the crew's accounts consistent with a genuine experience of something extraordinary. Some people did not. The division of local opinion that had formed during the 5 days of the search did not vanish when Walton came back. Well, if anything, the return made the division more specific, because now there was a returned person, and a returned person has things to say, and what is said can be evaluated and debated and argued over in ways that an absence cannot be. The absence itself, though, that persists as a fact in the record, independent of any interpretation. On November 5th, 1975, Travis Walton was present on a forest road in the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest with 6 other men. On November 10th, he was at a gas station payphone in Heber, Arizona, in a physically distressed state that a medical examination found consistent with the passage of 5 days. Between those 2 points, a ground search of the Turkey Springs area and surrounding terrain conducted over multiple days by law enforcement personnel and search and rescue teams found no trace of him. Those 3 things, present on November 5th, absent for 5 days, present again on November 10th, are documented. They are the structure the case has always rested on, and no investigation has altered that structure. The search logs from the days between November 5th and November 10th are quiet documents. They record the dates, the areas covered, the personnel involved, the findings, which is to say the non-findings, the systematic confirmation that the terrain that was searched did not contain the person being searched for. They are the kind of document that exists in every missing persons investigation and that usually, eventually, is superseded by a resolution, by the person being found somewhere the search had not yet reached, or by a development that moves the investigation in a new direction. In the Walton case, the search logs are superseded by a phone call from a payphone in Heber, rather than by anything the search itself produced. The forest remained unexplained. The absence remained unexplained. The log simply stopped when the phone rang, the way all active searches stop when the person they are looking for turns up somewhere else. What the investigation had, by the time November 10th had passed and the initial shock of the return had settled, was a file, interview statements from 6 men, search logs covering 5 days of unsuccessful forest work, medical findings from a physical examination, a timeline beginning at approximately 7:30 p.m. on November 5th, when the crew first contacted the sheriff's department, and ending at a gas station in Heber, 12 miles from home. The file was the record. Everything else, every interpretation, every hypothesis, every argument for and against the crew's account, every attempt to explain the 5 days, had to reckon with that file, because the file was what had actually been documented in real time by people doing their jobs in a county sheriff's office in rural Arizona. The November air in the White Mountains is cold enough by the 10th of the month that the pines hold a particular stillness in the evenings, the kind of stillness that comes when the temperature drops fast after sunset and the wind has gone quiet and the forest settles into itself. Somewhere in that forest, during the 5 days between November 5th and November 10th, The Turkey Springs clearing sat empty in that stillness, the cut timbers stacked at the margins where the crew had left it, the ground undisturbed, the search teams moving through in the daylight hours and finding nothing, and the nights long and cold and dark and quiet, in the way that remote, high-country forests are quiet, with no traffic on the unpaved roads and no lights between the trees, and nothing to indicate that anything had happened there at all. The gas station in Heber, where the phone rang on the night of November 10th, was the end of the 5 days, at least in the sense that the measurable record of an absence formally concluded there, with a call from a payphone to a brother-in-law's house 12 miles away. The phone booth itself, its fluorescent light, the receiver off the hook, the man discovered on the floor or nearby in a state of confusion that would take time and rest to resolve, is the image at the end of 5 days of nothing. It is a concrete and specific image. It has a location and a time, and 2 additional witnesses who arrived to find it, Grant Neff and Dwayne Walton, driving the short distance from Snowflake, reaching the station, and finding what they found. The 5 days folded somehow into the person standing or lying in the light of the phone booth, the interval between the forest road and the gas station unaccounted for and quietly, stubbornly present. The records of the search, the logs, the interview statements, the medical findings, the timeline assembled by the sheriff's department do not explain what happened in the days between. They document the outside of those days with care and precision. They establish the duration. They establish the conditions of the return. They do not and could not account for the inside. The inside remained and remains Walton's own. What the record holds, sitting quietly in the files of a Navajo County investigation that was eventually concluded without a formal explanation, is the shape of an interval, 5 days, a search, a return, a phone call made from a gas station lit up against the dark Arizona road, and the particular quality of a gap that the documented evidence surrounds completely but cannot fill. The search teams who worked the Turkey Springs area in the days between November 5th and November 10th did their jobs well by every available account. They covered the terrain, they worked the grid, they looked for what they were trained to look for in conditions that were cold and demanding and without the guidance of any physical evidence pointing them in a particular direction. They found the forest the way the forest is, dense and still and patient and unrevealing. They came out of the trees each evening having confirmed the absence rather than resolved it. And the absence, day by day, became the case, not a preliminary fact to be explained by a subsequent discovery, but the central and durable fact of a disappearance that the external record has never fully accounted for. By the time Travis Walton was found at the gas station in Heber on the night of November 10th, the investigation had been running for 5 days without a resolution, and the resolution when it came was not a resolution in the investigative sense. It was a return, a phone call, a man alive, 12 miles from where he had disappeared, the 5 days unaccounted for in everything but their physical effects. The medical examination put its findings on paper. The sheriff's department updated its files. The missing persons case closed in the most literal sense. The question the case had always been asking, where was Travis Walton between November 5th and November 10th, and how did he come to be at a gas station in Heber, Arizona, in a state of confusion and physical distress that a medical examination found consistent with 5 days of absence? That question remained where it had been from the beginning, open, documented, and in the record of a small county sheriff's office in rural Arizona, quietly and stubbornly unresolved. The payphone at the Haber gas station was an ordinary object, the kind of phone booth that stood outside gas stations across rural America in 1975, a small lit enclosure against the dark, the receiver hanging or held, the coin slot and the dial face, and the fluorescent light above, making a small bright square against the surrounding night. It was the last stop in a 5-day interval the search had not been able to close from the outside. Travis Walton was there, holding the receiver, having called the one number that would bring people he knew to that specific place on that specific night. And the 5 days were behind him somewhere, in the forest, in the record, in the growing beard that the medical examination would later note and measure, present as a fact, quiet as the forest at night, and carrying, as that interval has carried ever since, the particular weight of something documented and unresolved, sitting in the archive the way the pines sit in the forest, still and patient and exactly where they were left. The room Walton described waking in had a low ceiling, the walls curved, the light had no visible source. He has described this moment across several decades of accounts, in his 1978 book, in his 1996 memoir, in interviews given at conferences, and on recordings, and in the kind of small, careful conversations that researchers conduct when they are trying to establish whether a story has stayed the same over time. The details have stayed the same. The ceiling was low, the walls were smooth, the air was warm and carried a slight moisture, the way a room carries warmth when it has been sealed for a while, and whatever heats it does not declare itself. There was no sound he could name. There was no window. There was no obvious point of entry or exit. What he knew was that he was lying on a surface, and above him the ceiling curved, and the light came from everywhere at once, and from nowhere he could identify, and he was not where he had been. He had been on a forest road in Arizona. The truck had been idling. The pines had been standing close on either side, dark at the edges and pale where the headlights reached them. And then something had struck him, and now he was here, in this room, with its low curved ceiling and its sourceless warm light, and the 5 days that would account for the interval between those two moments have not in any documented account been fully explained. What Walton describes of those first conscious moments in the room is primarily the strangeness of the physical environment. Not terror, not pain, but a quality of disorientation so complete that his mind, by his account, worked mainly at the level of sensation and immediate detail. The surface beneath him, the temperature of the air, the light. He has described looking around the room and finding it empty except for himself. The walls were close, the ceiling was close. There was a quality to the material of the room, smooth, somewhere between organic and manufactured, that did not resolve into any familiar category. Not metal, as he knew metal, not plastic as he knew plastic. Something that fell between those descriptions and required new language to approach, language he has noted he does not entirely have. Even now, after decades of trying to find it, he remembers trying to sit up. He remembers the effort of taking inventory, his body, the room, the silence, the light. He was not injured in any way he could immediately identify. He was not restrained. The room was simply there, and he was in it, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for either the room or the fact of being in it. There is a particular quality to Walton's account of this early period, the time between waking and first contact with anything other than the room itself, that has been noted by researchers who have followed the case across its several decades. He describes it with the specific sensory flatness of someone reporting facts, rather than the heightened color of someone narrating an adventure. The ceiling was low, the walls curved, the air was warm. These are not dramatic details. They are the kind of details a person reports when they are trying to reconstruct an environment they were actually in, working from memory rather than imagination, reaching for precision rather than effect. Whether they represent genuine recollection or some other process, the texture of the account has remained consistent enough across a long stretch of time that researchers examining it have noted the consistency as a feature worth considering. The first beings Walton describes encountering were small. He has placed their height at approximately 4 to 5 feet, with large domed heads and large dark eyes, and features that were small and positioned low on their faces. Their skin was pale, tending toward gray. He encountered several of them, by his account, in the same room or immediately adjacent to it, present in the room or entering it. He has described the moment of first awareness of them as preceding any exchange, any gesture, any communication of any kind. They were simply there. He was there. The room was there, with its low curved ceiling and its sourceless warm light. What researchers have noted about this description, particularly those examining the case in relation to what was broadly known and broadly circulated in American culture in 1975, is the question of the chronology. The figure now referred to broadly as the gray alien, the small pale being with the large dark eyes and the domed head, was not yet the common property of popular culture in November 1975. The dissemination of that archetype through American mass media, through films and television and popular paperbacks, had not yet fully occurred. The description Walton provided in 1975 to law enforcement and to researchers in the days and weeks following his return preceded the wide cultural distribution of the form he described. This detail has been documented by researchers examining the case, cited as a feature of the evidentiary record that does not lend itself to easy dismissal on the grounds of cultural contamination. It does not establish the account. It is simply a feature of the timeline that the record preserves. Walton describes leaving the immediate vicinity of those first beings, the small pale figures with the large dark eyes, and moving through the craft, if craft is the right word, which he has acknowledged may not be. The geometry of the space he describes is not the geometry of any structure built according to familiar principles. Corridors curved, rooms opened from rooms. Nothing was quite orthogonal. Nothing announced itself by its function in the way a room announces itself, as a kitchen, as a bedroom, as a hallway designed for passage from one identified place to another. The spaces simply existed. He moved through them. It was in this context of movement through the craft's interior that he encountered a second group of beings. These he has described as notably different from the first, taller, more proportional, more nearly human in their appearance, with amber or golden eyes and close-fitting smooth uniforms, and a quality of presence that Walton has consistently described as purposeful and calm. They did not speak to him. No verbal communication was established between them. He has noted this across his accounts with a specificity that suggests it registered as significant, even in the immediate experience, not simply the absence of speech, but something he understood, in the moment, as a kind of communication by other means, though what those means consisted of, he has not been able to describe with the same precision he brings to the physical details of the rooms and corridors. They guided him. That is the word he has used, in consistent variation across the accounts that survive, not led in any coercive sense, not escorted in the manner of custody or control, guided in the sense of accompanying and indicating direction moving him through the curved interior of the craft without touching him, or touching him minimally towards something he could not yet see. He has described the quality of their attention as calm. He has described the movement as unhurried. Whatever they were moving him toward, they did not appear to be in any urgency about it, and whatever alarm he carried from the room where he had woken was by his account not heightened by anything in their manner. The room they brought him to was larger than what he had passed through. He has described a domed ceiling, higher than the ceiling of the first room, and at the center of that room beneath the dome, a reclining chair. The chair was positioned so that whoever occupied it would be looking upward, and above it the dome displayed what Walton has described as a star field, a representation of stars, or stars themselves, visible through the dome's material or projected on its surface. He has acknowledged he could not determine which, and the distinction has remained unresolved across his accounts. The field was detailed, the stars were present in the kind of density and pattern that the naked eye finds in a clear dark sky, far from artificial light, the kind of sky that exists above the Apache-Sitgreaves in November, above the Turkey Springs work site, above the road where the truck had been stopped with its headlights on. He sat in the chair. He has described this as a choice made in the moment, or something that functioned like a choice, in the way that choices function inside experiences that are so far outside familiar categories that the ordinary vocabulary of volition becomes uncertain. He sat in the chair, and the star field was above him, and for a period whose duration he has acknowledged he cannot establish, he occupied that room in the quiet that had characterized every space he had passed through. The beings who had guided him were present at the margins of the room. They did not press anything on him. They did not speak. The stars, or their representation, continued to be present on the dome above him. There were what appeared to be controls at the chair, or near it. He has described reaching toward them, or interacting with them in some preliminary way, before being guided back from them, not forcibly, by his consistent account, but with a quality of gentle redirection, the way one might steer a child away from something interesting, but not for them. He has not been able to specify what the controls looked like, or what function they might have served, or whether his interaction with them produced any observable effect. They were there. He reached toward them. He was guided away. The account at this point carries the particular texture of memory, working at the edge of what it can retrieve, specific enough to be reported, uncertain enough to resist the kind of hard-edged description that characterizes the earlier details of the rooms and the corridors and the chair. He was led then back through the craft's interior, the same curved corridors, the same diffuse light that came from the walls or the air or something between them, the taller beings accompanying him without speaking, their amber eyes. He has specified the color in consistent accounts across many years, amber or golden, a detail that distinguishes them from the small pale figures in his description of the early encounter. Their amber eyes attentive but not alarming, their movement through the craft's interior as unhurried as it had been before. He has described this return passage through the craft as carrying a different quality than the initial movement through it. Then he had been disoriented, still assembling the fact of where he was. Now, by his account, something had settled, not understanding, not comfort exactly, but the particular quality of having been somewhere long enough that the strangeness becomes, in a limited sense, familiar. The curved ceilings still curved. The sourceless light still came from everywhere and nowhere. But he had been inside this for some time, however much time had passed, and the initial shock of the environment had moved into something quieter. What he emerged into was larger. He has described it as an enclosed bay, or hangar, a space significantly larger than any of the rooms he had passed through, with a scale that implied an interior much greater than the exterior of the craft he had entered, or believed he had entered, off the forest road in Arizona. The proportions are one of the details in his account that resist easy spatial reasoning. The craft, as the crew described it from outside, was of a scale consistent with a large disc-shaped vehicle at low altitude. The interior Walton describes does not straightforwardly correspond to the exterior dimensions, the crew reported. He has acknowledged this in published statements without offering an explanation, noting it as one of the features of the experience that does not resolve into familiar three-dimensional geometry, and leaving it there. In the bay there were other craft, or other objects that resembled the craft he had been inside. He has described them as present but inactive, resting on the floor of the bay in the sourceless ambient light, their forms consistent with what the crew had reported seeing in the clearing, disc-shaped, smooth, no visible seams or joints or propulsion systems that he could identify. He did not approach them. The taller beings who had guided him through the interior were still present, and then, at some point in the bay, they were not. He has described a moment of finding himself alone in the space, or nearly alone, the other craft present and still, the bay lit in its quiet way, and no one accompanying him any further. He was escorted, then, by a figure he has described as wearing a helmet or a sealed suit toward an exit. The figure did not speak. The transition from the bay's interior to the outside is one of the points in his account where the memory becomes, by his own acknowledgement, less clear. He describes moving toward an opening. He describes the sense of transition from interior to exterior, a change in air, a change in temperature, the particular quality of open night sky after enclosed space. He was outside. He has described a paved surface beneath his feet, and open air, and the Arizona night sky above him, and then behind him or to one side of him, the craft, or the craft he had been in, or one of the craft from the bay, departing, rapidly and silently, rising and moving away, and becoming, within a very short period, too small to track against the dark sky. He was standing somewhere in the open, on a paved surface, under the night sky of Arizona. He did not know exactly where. He has described looking around and finding a road and finding familiar enough landmarks, the pale high desert landscape, the particular quality of the air at that elevation in November, to understand that he was somewhere in the vicinity of Heber, which is approximately 12 miles from Snowflake, approximately 15 to 20 miles from where the crew's truck had been parked on the Turkey Springs Road. He was not in the clearing. He was not on the forest road. He was on a paved surface in the open, and the craft that had brought him there or released him there was already too far away to see. The gap in his account between this moment and the gas station phone booth in Heber is one that Walton has acknowledged consistently across his public statements. He does not have a continuous memory of walking from the paved surface to the booth. He does not have a continuous memory of the period between standing in the open under the night sky and finding himself at the phone. He has described the gap not as a deliberate omission, but as an absence, a portion of the experience that did not produce the kind of memory that can be reported, either because something was done to prevent it, or because the state he was in during those final minutes did not permit the formation of retrievable memory, or for reasons he has not been able to determine. The gap is there. He has never been able to fill it. It sits in the account as a seam, present and documented, the join between what he can report and what he cannot, what Walton describes of the physical experience of returning, of the state his body was in during those last uncertain moments, and at the phone booth, is consistent with the medical findings made shortly after his family reached him. A quality of physical depletion, a confusion about time, the sense of having been somewhere for a period whose duration did not correspond to anything he had experienced as a passage of hours. He had not experienced 5 days. He has been consistent on this. Whatever interval he was inside, whatever duration his conscious memory accounts for, did not feel like 5 days. It felt shorter, or it felt discontinuous, or it felt like something the word duration does not quite hold. This is among the most consistently reported features of accounts like his, and it is among the features that the available evidence neither confirms nor explains. The gas station in Heber, when his brother Dwayne and his brother-in-law Grant Neff arrived, was lit. The booth was lit. Travis Walton was there. In the light, the 5 days unaccounted for behind him, and the night around the gas station extending in all directions toward the same forests and the same high desert sky he had left on the Turkey Springs Road in November. He was thinner than he had been. His beard had grown approximately 5 days' worth of growth. He was confused and not entirely coherent by the account of those who reached him. He was alive. He was in Hever, Arizona, on the night of November 10th, 1975, and the forest road where the truck had been stopped, and the clearing where the crew had described seeing the object, and the ponderosa pines standing close on either side of the unpaved track, were all still there, 15 or 20 miles north, unchanged by whatever had occurred. What the account does not provide, what Walton himself has been consistent in acknowledging it does not provide, is a continuous and complete narrative of 5 days. The gaps are present, and they are documented as gaps. The room with the low curved ceiling, the corridor, the taller beings with the amber eyes, the domed room with the star field and the chair, the bay with its other craft, the outside air and the paved surface, and the departing object overhead, and then the phone booth in Heber, and the receiver, and the light of the booth against the November dark. Between the paved surface and the phone booth, nothing. A seam in the account that has been there since 1975 and has not been closed. He has returned to this account many times, across many years, and the specific details have held: the ceiling low, the walls curved, the light sourceless and warm, the small pale figures, and then the taller ones with the amber eyes, the corridor, the domed room, the chair, the star field, the bay, the open air. These are the parts of the account that persist across the decades of retelling, when the 1978 book and the 1996 memoir and the conference appearances and the long, careful interviews conducted by researchers whose job is to watch for the places where a story shifts or elaborates or corrects itself over time. The account has not substantially shifted. It has not elaborated in the ways that typically indicate narrative confabulation, where the story grows to fill the gaps and the edges become sharper than the original experience would support. The gaps have stayed gaps. The uncertain parts have stayed uncertain. The seam between the paved surface and the phone booth has stayed a seam. This is one of the features of the Walton account that researchers examining it have documented as noteworthy. Not its vividness, not the specificity of the most vivid sections. Those qualities are present in accounts of all kinds, including accounts that have been demonstrated to be fabricated. What is noted is the consistency of the uncertainty, the places where Walton has, across decades of opportunities to elaborate, consistently declined to elaborate because he does not have the material to do so. A person constructing a false account under the sustained public pressure that has followed Walton across his adult life would find the gaps more uncomfortable than he appears to find them. They would have been filled, over time, with something. They have not been filled. The gap between the paved surface and the phone booth in Heber is the same gap in 2024 that it was in 1975, and it sits in the record, unchanged, waiting for something the record has not yet provided. The account of the room Walton woke in, with its low curved ceiling and its sourceless light, exists in a space the evidentiary record cannot fully enter. What he describes cannot be verified from outside his own testimony. It cannot be corroborated in the way that the crew's reported sighting can be examined against their individual statements and found to show consistency across 6 independent interviews. The crew was outside. They saw what they described seeing from outside the object. Walton, by his account, was inside something, and there were no other witnesses to the interior, and the physical traces of the 5 days, the beard growth, the dehydration, the caloric deficit recorded by the medical examination, established the duration of the absence without accounting for its content. What the record holds, then, is this. A man left a forest road in November 1975 under circumstances that 6 other people described to law enforcement. He was absent for 5 days. When he returned, his body showed the signs of 5 days passing. He provided a detailed account of the interval that has not changed in its essential structure across several decades of retelling. The account contains experiences that cannot be confirmed by any external record. It contains gaps that Walton has consistently identified and declined to fill. It contains physical descriptions of a craft's interior, of beings encountered inside it, of rooms and corridors, and a domed ceiling with a star field on it, that were provided in 1975 and have remained stable since. That stability is the most concrete thing the account offers. Not proof, which this kind of testimony cannot provide, not refutation, which the skeptical record has not achieved in any form that has resolved the case for the researchers who have examined it carefully. Simply stability, a story that has been told the same way in its essential features for 50 years by a man who has had every opportunity to change it and has not. The room is still there in the account. Low ceiling, curved walls, the light coming from everywhere and from nowhere, warm and sourceless, the air slightly moist, the silence total except for whatever sound the room itself made, which Walton has described as present but not quite nameable. A man lying on a surface, trying to understand where he was. The Turkey Springs road somewhere behind him, 15 or 20 miles of ponderosa forest, and unpaved track between him and the clearing where the truck had been stopped, with its headlights on. 5 days ahead of him, most of which he will not be able to account for when his brother and his brother-in-law find him at the phone booth in Heber, with the receiver in his hand and the November night stretching away in every direction across the high desert of Arizona. The star field on the dome of the room he describes was detailed. The stars were arranged the way stars are arranged above the Apache-Sitgreaves on a clear November night, when the forest is dark and the nearest town is 30 miles and the sky overhead has none of the ambient light that fills it, in places where people have gathered in numbers. He sat in the chair beneath them, however briefly, and looked up. Whatever they showed him, whether they were the actual sky seen through the dome's material, or a projection of something, or something else for which no familiar category applies, they were, by his account, present and detailed, and arranged in the way that stars are arranged above a dark forest at elevation in November, with the cold air holding them still, and the pines too dark to see, and the world around them very quiet and very wide. He was inside something, by his account, and the stars were above him, and the room was warm despite the November cold that would have been pressing on the forest outside, and the beings who had guided him there were at the margins of the room watching him in their unhurried way, and the account of what happened next, the movement back through the corridor, the bay, the open air, the paved surface, the departing craft, is the account he has given since 1975 in the same essential form, with the same gaps, with the same seam between the paved surface and the phone booth that has never been closed and has not been explained. Travis Walton stood on that paved surface in the open air on the night of November 10th, 1975, and watched the craft, or what he took to be the craft, move away into the dark Arizona sky. And then he was alone, and Heber was somewhere nearby, and the 5 days were behind him, like a country he had passed through, without a map, without a guide, without a record that anyone waiting for him at home could examine or enter or confirm. The phone booth was lit. The receiver was there. The night was the same night that existed on all sides of the gas station, extending outward through the dark toward the Turkey Springs Road and the clearing and the ponderosa pines, which were standing in their usual places, as they had been standing on November 5th when the truck had idled on the unpaved track and the crew had looked through the windshield at a light in the clearing. The forest had not changed. The road had not changed. Only the interval remained, patient and unresolved, with its low curved ceiling and its sourceless warm light, and its star field on a dome, and the quiet gap at the end where the account runs out and the phone booth begins. In the late autumn of 1975, in a small office in Navajo County, Arizona, 6 men who had spent days under the quiet pressure of a potential homicide investigation sat down to take polygraph examinations. The chairs were ordinary. The equipment was standard. The examiner, Cy Gilson, worked for the Arizona Department of Public Safety, and the documentation he produced that day was not a testimonial or an affidavit, but a professional record, a typed report with his name at the bottom and a conclusion rendered in the careful, impersonal language of a formal assessment. What that conclusion said was that the 6 men showed no deception when describing what they reported seeing on a forest road north of Heber on the evening of November 5th. 6 men, one conclusion, a piece of paper that has been sitting in various archives and investigation files ever since, still there, still saying the same thing. The days that preceded the examinations had not been easy ones for the crew. Law enforcement had treated the disappearance simultaneously as a missing persons case and as a potential murder inquiry, which placed the men in the particular position of being both witnesses to something they could not explain and suspects in a crime that may not have occurred. Mike Rogers, who had driven the truck and filed the original report, answered questions. Dwayne Smith answered questions. Ken Peterson and Alan Dallas and John Goulet and Steve Pierce answered questions. Each of them was interviewed by Navajo County Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and Under Sheriff Ken Copeland in the days following November 5th, and each of them told a version of the same account. A lit object visible through the trees, a truck stopped on a dirt road, a man stepping out across open ground towards something none of them had a word for. The interviews were recorded. The documents were filed. The case was formally open. Gillespie's department had organized search efforts across the Turkey Springs area in the days immediately following the incident, and those searches had produced nothing. Ground teams had moved through dense ponderosa pine, covering the terrain surrounding the area where the crew said the event had occurred, and returned without any physical trace, no signs of struggle, no physical evidence of any kind, no indication that the ground had been disturbed. The forest had been exactly as it always was. The absence at the center of the search was documented and absolute. A man had been there, and then he was not, and the record of the search simply confirmed the fact of his absence without providing any account of what it meant. Cy Gilson's polygraph report is one of the more unusual documents to have emerged from the case, not because of what it claims, but because of what kind of document it is. It is not the account of a witness. It is not an investigative conclusion. It is the output of a formal procedure administered by a credentialed professional operating within the ordinary systems of law enforcement, and its conclusion is that 6 named individuals showed no physiological signs of deception when describing the event they reported. The document does not say what the object was. It does not say where Travis Walton had been. It does not extend beyond what the examination could measure. It simply says that the men believed what they were saying. That is the boundary of what a polygraph examination establishes, and it is worth understanding the boundary clearly. Polygraph methodology has well-documented limitations, and the scientific literature on its reliability is not uniformly supportive of its conclusions. What the Gilson report establishes is not truth, but the measurable absence of a particular physiological response associated with deception. The distinction matters. The document still sits in the record, making exactly that narrower claim, nothing more and nothing less. The National Enquirer became involved in the case in the weeks that followed, which added a layer of complexity that investigators and researchers have been accounting for ever since. In the mid-1970s, the National Enquirer was one of the highest circulation publications in the United States, and it had established an award program for UFO reports it deemed credible and well documented. Travis Walton's case attracted the publication's attention, and a second polygraph examination was administered to Walton himself, this one by examiner George Pfeiffer, and conducted in connection with the award process. Pfeiffer's examination also returned a conclusion of no deception. The financial prize associated with the award became, in subsequent years, a specific point of contention for researchers who questioned the case, and Philip Klass in particular would argue that the conditions under which the Walton polygraph was administered, the prize, the publicity, the institutional interest of the organization conducting it, complicated the weight it could be assigned as independent evidence. The argument has been noted in investigative accounts of the case and has not been fully resolved either way. Philip Klass deserves his full place in this record because he worked through the case with more methodical attention than almost anyone else who engaged with it critically. Klass was an aviation journalist, not a credulous believer in extraterrestrial visitation, and not a dismissive skeptic who refused to engage with the specifics. He read the documents, he tracked the timelines, he examined the polygraph methodology, he looked at the financial records associated with Mike Rogers' United States Forest Service thinning contract, and identified something that other analysts had not foregrounded. Rogers' contract was behind schedule when the incident was reported. The deadline under which Rogers was operating had not been met, and Klass argued in multiple published analyses that this created a plausible motive for fabrication, that an extraordinary reported event, if it could be established as credible, might have provided Rogers grounds to exit the contract without the financial penalties that would have applied to a simple failure to complete the work. It was a specific argument grounded in a specific document, the contract itself, with its terms and its timeline, and it has remained a part of the critical record of the case from the moment Klass published it. Rogers and Walton have disputed the Klass argument consistently across decades of public statements, and their responses have also been documented. Rogers has maintained that the contract's delayed status was not a sufficient motive to fabricate an account of the scale and complexity that the crew's statements described, and has argued that the personal and professional consequences of the report, the suspicion, the investigation, the years of public scrutiny that followed, represented costs far in excess of any benefit the fabrication hypothesis could account for. Walton has made similar arguments across published interviews and appearances. Neither position resolves the question that Klass's research raised, which is simply this: the contract was behind schedule, the fact is documented, and what it means in relation to the events of November 5th, 1975, remains a point on which accounts differ. A second polygraph examination of Walton, conducted in 1993 in connection with the Paramount Pictures film Fire in the Sky, produced results that were more difficult to interpret. Some accounts of that examination reported that the examining professional noted potential deception on specific questions, a finding that, if accepted at face value, would complicate the picture established by the Pfeiffer examination from 1975. Walton and his supporters have disputed the interpretation of those 1993 results, arguing that the methodology was flawed and that the conclusions drawn from the examination were not supported by the data. The dispute has not been resolved in a way that satisfies all parties. What the 1993 examination added to the record was not clarity, but a second layer of contested evidence. A polygraph disputing a polygraph, the findings of one procedure set against the findings of another, the evidentiary picture growing more complex rather than simpler as the years moved away from the original event. What the record holds at this point is two polygraph examinations pointing in one direction and one examination with contested methodology pointing in another. No instrument in the record resolves the tension between them. The film Fire in the Sky, released by Paramount Pictures in 1993, represents a moment in the case's history that requires careful handling, because what the film depicted and what Walton had documented in his published accounts were substantially different things. Walton himself has stated publicly and on multiple occasions that the abduction sequence, as constructed for the film, did not reflect what he had described in the Walton Experience, his 1978 account of the events, nor in the consistent testimony he had given across years of public appearances and documented interviews. The filmmakers constructed an abduction sequence that has been described by those familiar with Walton's actual account as more suited to the conventions of horror filmmaking than to the specific, measured, and relatively non-threatening experience Walton described. Walton's objections to the film's depiction are part of the documented record. The film reached a far wider audience than any of Walton's published accounts. The divergence between what Walton said he experienced and what millions of people saw in a cinema in 1993 is itself a fact about the case's long cultural life, the distance that grew between the primary account and the version of it that most people encountered. The distinction matters for a particular reason. When researchers evaluate reported accounts of this kind, one of the considerations they examine is the degree to which the report's specific details were in circulation in popular culture before the account was made. Walton's initial description of the beings he encountered, approximately 4 to 5 feet tall, large domed heads, large dark eyes, small features, pale or grayish complexion, was given in 1975, in statements to law enforcement, and in the year immediately following the incident. Researchers examining the case have noted that the widespread cultural dissemination of what would later be called the gray alien archetype, the specific visual shorthand that became pervasive in American popular media, came substantially after 1975. The chronological detail does not confirm Walton's account. It complicates the simplest version of the fabrication argument, which would require the crew to have invented, from whole cloth, a visual description that had not yet been culturally established. The point has been noted in the literature without resolving into a definitive conclusion in either direction. The Aerial Phenomena Research Organization engaged with the Walton case in the period following the incident, and researchers associated with that organization identified what they considered to be the most significant structural feature of the case: the fact that 6 independent witnesses documented the preliminary event. The majority of reported abduction accounts in the published record involve a single witness with no corroboration. The Walton case is structured differently. Whatever happened on the evening of November 5th, 1975, there are 6 named individuals who reported witnessing the beginning of it, each of whom was interviewed separately, and each of whom produced a consistent account of what they saw before Walton's absence began. The consistency of those 6 accounts across separate interviews, taken under conditions of legal pressure, has been cited as a distinguishing feature of the case in UFO research literature from 1975 to the present. It does not establish what the object was. It does not establish where Walton went. It establishes that 6 men told consistent stories under circumstances that did not make consistent lying easy. What Walton himself described across decades of documented retelling has remained notably stable. The curved room, the sourceless light, the beings he encountered first, small, with large eyes and domed heads, and the second group, more human in appearance, taller, amber-eyed, wearing close-fitting garments. The corridor, the domed room with the reclining chair and the ceiling that appeared to display a star field. The large enclosed bay, the paved surface outside, the open air and the Arizona night, and the gap in his memory between that moment and the gas station phone booth in Heber, where his brother-in-law found him. The account has been given in interviews, in published books, in conference appearances spanning more than 4 decades, and the specific details have not substantially changed. Researchers who examine cases of this kind consider internal consistency across decades of retelling to be one of the features worth noting, while acknowledging that consistency alone does not establish the truth of the underlying events. Both things remain true at once. The Navajo County Sheriff's Department case file exists. This is a simple and concrete fact about the case, and it is worth resting in for a moment. The file holds the original interview statements from the 6 crew members taken in November 1975 by Gillespie's department. It holds the search logs, the documented record of where teams went, how long they searched, and what they found. It holds the timeline of the evening of November 5th, from the reported incident at approximately 6 p.m. to the first call to the department at approximately 7:30 p.m. It holds the record of Walton's return on the night of November 10th, the medical examination that followed, the documentation of his physical condition. The case is formally unresolved. The file does not close a case that has not been closed. It simply holds the record, names, dates, times, terrain descriptions, the specific and ordinary language of law enforcement documentation applied to something that the language was not designed to account for. Marlon Gillespie, who served as Navajo County Sheriff during the investigation, was operating within the ordinary procedures of a county law enforcement department in the mid-1970s. He had no institutional framework for evaluating the crew's report beyond the standard categories available to him: missing persons, potential homicide, witness statements, physical search. He applied those categories, worked through the procedures they entailed, and produced a documented record that reflects the encounter between ordinary law enforcement process and something the process could not fully categorize. The record he created is not a conclusion. It is an account of a procedure applied at its limits. The documents it produced have been reviewed by researchers, cited in published analyses, and contested and defended in the literature for nearly 5 decades. Gillespie himself retired. The file remained. The case's presence in UFO research literature has not diminished with time. In the years following 1975, it appeared in the publications of organizations engaged in the systematic collection and analysis of UAP reports. In the 1990s, the film brought it to a mass audience, however imperfectly. In the 2000s and 2010s, Walton continued to appear at conferences and in documented interviews, telling the same account with the same specific details. In the 2020s, as governmental and institutional attention to unidentified aerial phenomena increased in the United States, with formal congressional hearings, official Defense Department acknowledgments, and the establishment of institutional mechanisms for reporting and investigating UAP, the Walton case was among those cited by researchers as significant because of its structural features, multiple witnesses, documented law enforcement response, physical trace evidence evaluated through formal procedure, and a primary witness whose account has maintained internal consistency over an unusual span of time. None of this establishes what happened on the forest road north of Heber on the evening of November 5th, 1975. The polygraph records do not establish it. The search logs do not establish it. The medical examination does not establish it. The decades of consistent testimony do not establish it. The case sits in the record as it has always sat, specific, documented, actively contested in some of its particulars, and at its center, holding a 5-day interval that no investigation has been able to account for. A man was present on a forest road, and then was not. He reappeared 5 days later at a gas station in Heber, physically intact, with 5 days of beard growth on his face, and no satisfactory account of where he had been that could be verified against any external record. The beard was real. The gap was real. What filled the gap has not been established. The small-town dimension of the case is something that tends to get lost in the larger story that the national coverage and the film created, but it belongs in the record. Snowflake, Arizona, in 1975, was a community where people knew each other, where the Rogers crew were not strangers, but neighbors and acquaintances, and known quantities. The response to the crew's report in Snowflake itself was divided, as contemporaneous newspaper accounts from the period reflect. Some in the community who knew the men personally found them credible. Others suspected fabrication, and the division followed, lines that had more to do with personal knowledge of the individuals involved than with any formal evaluation of the evidence. That division is itself a piece of the social texture of the case, the particular quality of something extraordinary emerging from a place where the people it involved were not anonymous. Mike Rogers was a local contractor with a documented history in the area. Travis Walton had grown up in the region. When their names appeared in the national press, they were not figures in an abstract story. They were people from a specific community of roughly 4,000 residents on the Colorado Plateau, and the people who knew them had to decide what they thought had happened to someone they recognized. The question of what motivated the crew, if the account was fabricated, has never been satisfactorily answered by the fabrication hypothesis. Class's contract argument is the most specific and grounded version of that hypothesis, and it accounts for a possible motive for Rogers specifically. It is harder to account for the participation of 6 men in a fabricated account under conditions of a homicide investigation, with the personal and professional consequences that investigation entailed. Researchers who have examined the case from a skeptical position have acknowledged this structural difficulty without resolving it. The fabrication hypothesis does not become impossible simply because it is difficult. It simply becomes more complicated than the most straightforward version of it suggests. Both the case for the account's credibility and the case against it carry unresolved elements. The record holds them both. The experience of being in a case like this, of following the documented record to its edges, and finding those edges where they are, rather than where one might prefer them, has a particular quality. The Walton case does not resolve cleanly in any direction. It does not reduce to a simple story of confirmed extraterrestrial contact, and it does not reduce to a simple story of successful fraud. It is more complicated and more interesting than either version of itself. The polygraph record points one way and then another. The testimony is consistent, but consistency alone cannot establish truth. The physical evidence is present in some forms. The beard, the documented medical findings, the physical condition of the man who reappeared, and absent in others. The object that 6 men reported seeing from inside a stopped truck on a dark forest road left no physical trace at the Turkey Springs site that search teams could identify. The absence of physical trace does not mean it was not there. It means that whatever was there, if anything was there, it did not leave the kind of mark the search was equipped to find. The forest at Turkey Springs is still there. The ponderosa pines that the Rogers crew had been thinning under their USFS contract are older now by nearly 5 decades. The specific trees they cleared long since grown over by the generations that followed. The unpaved roads through that section of the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest follow the same routes they followed in 1975, winding through the high country terrain north of Heber, across dirt and packed rock, inaccessible to any casual or passing traffic. The Turkey Springs site is marked on USFS maps the same way it has always been, a location on a grid, a section of forest in a management district, identified by coordinates and acreage and the bureaucratic notations of a land management system. There is nothing at the site to mark what was reported there. There is no physical record on the ground of the November evening that became, over the following decades, one of the most documented and most contested cases in UFO research literature. Bud Hopkins Purbiof Barakatumapur, who spent years examining and documenting reported abduction accounts, and who identified consistent features across large numbers of independently given reports, considered the Walton case significant for the reason the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization had identified the 6 witnesses. Hopkins noted that in the majority of cases he examined, the abduction event itself was solitary, the witness alone, the experience unverifiable by external observation. The Walton case offered something structurally different, a preliminary event witnessed by 6 people who were not Walton, documented in law enforcement records, and consistently reported across separate interviews. Whether one accepts the crew's account of what they saw or not, the account itself is in the record, and it is there in a form, multiple witnesses, separate interviews, documented in real time, that most reported cases of this kind cannot match. Hopkins considered this a significant feature. Class considered it insufficient to establish the account's truth. Both positions are part of the record. What George Pfeiffer's 1975 polygraph examination of Walton measured and what Cy Gilson's examinations of the 6 crew members measured was something narrower than the truth of the underlying events. Polygraph methodology measures physiological responses that have been associated with deception under controlled conditions. The scientific literature on the reliability of those measurements is mixed, and the legal admissibility of polygraph results has been restricted in many jurisdictions precisely because the method does not meet the standard of scientific reliability that more robust forensic techniques can demonstrate. The Gilson report is not a scientific demonstration that the crew witnessed an extraordinary event. The Pfeiffer report is not a scientific demonstration that Walton experienced what he described. Both documents say something more limited, that the individuals examined were not, at the time of examination, producing the physiological responses associated with deliberate deception. That narrower claim is what the documents can honestly be said to establish, and it is a claim that sits in the record as part of the evidence rather than as a resolution of it. The case has been in the world for nearly 50 years. It has traveled from a sheriff's department interview room in Navajo County to the pages of a National Enquirer special edition to the published books of a man who spent decades explaining, in his own words, what he said he experienced in 5 days he otherwise cannot account for. It has traveled through Philip Klass's published analyses and through the literature of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and through conferences where Walton has told the same story with the same consistent details to rooms full of people who arrived already having formed opinions about it in both directions. It has traveled through the 1993 film that depicted a version of the events Walton himself disowned, and through the expanded governmental attention to UAP that has characterized the 2020 ep, and it arrives at the present moment, still holding all of the things it has always held. The 6 consistent witness statements, the Gilson polygraph report, the 5 days of beard growth on a man who reappeared at a gas station, the gap in the record that no investigation has been able to fill. The file in the Navajo County Archive holds all of this. It holds the interview transcripts, each one in its own handwriting or typeface, each one recording a version of the same account given by a different man under the same conditions of legal pressure. It holds the search logs, the documented absence, the timeline from incident to phone call to law enforcement response to a 5-day search that found nothing. It holds the notation of Walton's return, the medical findings, the specific and limited physical evidence that his absence had lasted as long as the calendar said it had. The file does not close.